Hi, welcome back to lecture number 14. This is the second lecture in period 3, all about the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War. The historical theme that we're focusing on today is America in the world. The learning objective for today is explain the causes and effects of the 7 Years' War. And we have three key concepts that we're going to get to. The first one is colonial rivalry intensified between Britain and France in the mid-18th century as the growing population of the British colonies expanded into the interior of North America, threatening French Indian trade networks and American Indian autonomy. So let's talk about this population expansion. At the time of the beginning of the French and Indian War, the colonies contained now 1.2 million colonists, and compared to the 60,000 French settlers or French fur traders, there's a great imbalance. And these 1.2 million colonists are wanting to continue to expand into that dark green area that you see on the map that belonged to the French or had been claimed by the French. The British colonists, they continue pushing west, and as they continue pushing west, they are going to run into more conflicts. These French and Indian trade networks relied on the fur trade, and so therefore the French had a better relationship with the surrounding native groups because they required their help in getting the furs to send back to Europe. But that doesn't mean that the British won't have some Native American allies either. So we'll see that when the fighting actually begins. So the 7 Years' War breaks out over the French forts in the Ohio River Valley. You can see on the map on the bottom left that the first couple of battles happened here along the Ohio River Valley. And the first one is Fort Duquesne. So at Fort Duquesne, the French sent George Washington back to Virginia in defeat. He had been ordered to tell the French to stop building there since that was land that was being claimed by Virginia. And because of this defeat, Britain sends more troops from England, and they are led by General Edward Braddock. And when the British troops get here early on, they start to employ military techniques that are commonly used in Europe. But because of the different geography and the thick forests that are found in North America, they end up losing a lot of the early battles. General Braddock dies in his first expedition. George Washington was along with him, and he is able to get the remaining troops back out in a retreat and helps them survive. During this time, the colonies are being encouraged to band together to provide more troops, to provide more tax revenue to help with the cost of the war. In the Albany Plan of Union, this was developed by Ben Franklin, and the political cartoon that he created on the bottom left, the Join or Die, was trying to get the point across that the colonies needed to band together, otherwise they were going to be overrun by the French. Eventually there is a British victory, and that's mostly due to the strategy from Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder. So William Pitt takes over in the midst of the war, and he changes the strategy to trying to conquer the settlements along the St. Lawrence River in French Canada. They conquer the fort at Louisbourg, at Quebec, and then later on to Montreal. That finally leads to the victory. So on the bottom left, you see the French surrendering in Montreal. They signed the Peace Treaty of Paris in 1763. It settles the terms of peace, and it's going to give Great Britain large amounts of territory in North America. So that leads us to the next key concept. Britain achieved a major expansion of its territorial holdings by defeating the French, but at tremendous expense, setting the stage for imperial efforts to raise revenue and consolidate control over the colonies. So for the territorial gains, Britain gets Canada, Florida, and all the territory east of the Mississippi River. Spain, who had allied with Britain, gets all of the Louisiana territory. So they are able to expand their New World holdings from Central America and what is now Latin America, all the way up to North America into Alaska. But the war came at a great cost for the British in mobilizing all those troops to North America. It was more expensive than the previous three wars that the British had fought against the French. That was Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and King William's War. Those are not in any particular order. But because it was so much more expensive, the British had to find a way to pay for it. And the taxes for British landowners in England was already really high, and the king could not raise their taxes anymore. So he looked to the colonists to help pay for the war that they so greatly benefited from. So the first attempts at raising revenue were the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. Um, the Stamp Act, as you can see on the top right, shows that the colonists had to include a royal stamp for any type of um, legal paper or newspaper or any type of printed product had to include this royal stamp. And depending on the product, the stamp had to be worth a different amount. This made the publishers in the colonies, the lawyers in the colonies that were going to be mostly affected by this, really angry. They're the ones that are leading the boycotts. And eventually, the crown and the parliament are going to capitulate to the demands of the colonists, and they will repeal the Stamp Act. The colonists are so happy that they're going to build a statue in the name of King George, and they're going to put it up in this Bowling Green Park in New York. So the painting on the left shows you the statue of King George. However, it shows you the statue of King George a little bit later on in the century, where the colonists are beginning to declare independence. So Britain starts to consolidate control. They start stationing troops in North America to protect the new territory from Native American invaders. So the Native Americans who had allied with the French were still hostile towards the British, and they wanted to keep the colonists out of that new territory until the situation was more calm, so that there would not be another war that they would have to pay for. And because there were more troops in North America, Britain passes the Quartering Act, which allows for British troops to be housed in the properties of the colonists. That made them very angry. Here on this next key concept, it says, after the British victory, imperial officials attempted to prevent colonists from moving westward, generated colonial opposition, while native groups sought to both continue trading with Europeans and resist the encroachment of colonists on tribal lands. So the reason why the British passed the Proclamation of 1763 to keep colonists from moving west was because of a coordinated set of attacks by various Native American groups led by one chief named Pontiac. So this is referred to as Pontiac's Rebellion. So they were coordinated, and they started attacking from as far north as New York to as far south as Virginia. And the reason why the Native Americans were attacking British forts is because, one, they might have been allies of the French and were still hostile to the British occupation, and two, there were colonists and groups of colonists that were speculating or squatting in the area that Native Americans had previously occupied west of the Appalachians. One of these groups was the Paxton Boys. These were Scots-Irish who were some of the first frontier people to start expanding into that western territory. And oftentimes when they ran into conflicts with Native Americans, they would carry out massacres of Native Americans. So you can see a massacre being carried out on the bottom left there by Paxton Boys on Native Americans. The British troops eventually put down the uprisings of Pontiac's Rebellion, but it was enough to get the British to say to the colonists that they were not allowed to move past the Appalachians. The document that made this official was the Proclamation of 1763. It prevented colonists from further westward movement. You see on the map there the line that it covered and how it kept the western portion of that land as Indian Reserve. If the colonists wanted to move into that land, they had to have special permission from the British, and they had to purchase that land directly from Parliament. Obviously, the colonists are angry about this because they had just spent the entirety of the war fighting so that they could move into that land. All right, finally, our recap. The 7 Years' War erupted as a result of European rivalries in North America between the British and the French. The British won despite the slow start, and it was the most decisive war between European powers. So it was more decisive than the previous 3 wars that they had fought, and it led to more territorial gains for Britain. The large debt from the war as the cause for the revenue-raising efforts like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. And then finally, natives sought to maintain autonomy through Pontiac's uprising, and they were successful in shifting the British expansion policy to keep colonists from continuing to expand. So now it's the colonists that are going to be angry with Britain, and that's going to lead to them declaring independence. So in the next couple of lectures, we're going to see how the colonists made their way to finally declaring independence. All right, so that's it for this lecture, and I will see you on the next one.